Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill. Another Saturday in the books. Now it's time to predict what that college football playoff picture looks like heading into next week. And there are so many things that you have to account for when you're trying to predict what the 12-team college football playoff is going to look like. Like there is a part of it where it's just you're evaluating these college football teams, but there's another aspect where you kind of got to evaluate what does the pathway look like for each of these teams to make the 12-team playoff. There's going to be some really interesting conversations. I think most importantly with this kind of episode, and Dill, I know you certainly have some problems with these as well. There's going to be a lot of debates that I don't necessarily have the answers to. Like, what happens if it's a one-loss Indiana team with a one-loss to Ohio State sitting there 11-1? Do they get into the 12-team college football playoff over a two-loss SEC team? A lot of different conversations we're going to be having over the next couple of weeks. Let it fly in the comments section. That is the best part about doing this. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, without further ado, let's start at the top as we always do. I think Oregon is still the number one team in the country. I think they run the table. I think they win the Big Ten. At the end of the day, Oregon is just the most complete team in college football. Like, where are the question marks with that team? This is where I think it gets interesting. Like, Dill, Georgia, if they run the table, win the SEC championship, which is currently my prediction after what we saw in Austin, Texas a couple of weeks ago, they get the number 2 spot over a Miami team that I think is going to be undefeated, ACC champion coming in at number 3, BYU coming in at 4. I want to talk first about Notre Dame. Do you talk about the biggest winner of Saturday? It's probably Notre Dame for two different reasons. One, they beat a top 25 Navy team, but I think more importantly, that win against Texas A&M week 1 in College Station is suddenly getting more and more impressive. Like, we weren't sure how that win looked to start the year. Now Texas A&M seems like one of the top dogs in the SEC. Dill, Notre Dame coming in at 8. With that loss to NIU, do you see them? I think we both feel confident that Notre Dame's going to run the table. Do you think Notre Dame has a chance to get higher than number 8 with that loss against NIU?
No, honestly, if I'm looking at could they move up or down, I think there's a better chance they get missed out, even if they win out. Because you look like, again, I like the A&M win. I think a lot of people, and I'm not sure it's a fair argument, but are going to say, what if A&M had Marcel Reed going in that game? Because at the end of the day, Wigman cost A&M that game. He played really, really poorly. He was turning the ball over, and that offense just wasn't going. I think that'll be one question. And frankly, you look at a team like Indiana, if they only lose to Ohio State and they beat the wheels off everyone else they play like they've been doing, and they have wins over teams like Michigan, I mean, an 11-1 Notre Dame versus an 11-1 Indiana is going to be really tight. And frankly, if they don't give it to Indiana, that'll kind of show. I think a lot of Indiana fans will be crying foul of the old adage, like that's all about preseason rankings. Because at the end of the day, resume to resume, Indiana won't have the better win, but they're not going to have an embarrassing loss like that NIU one is. And they've beaten teams really badly, where Notre Dame's been in some dogfights with teams like Louisville that just aren't that good.
Well, I do think Louisville is kind of a good team. That being said, it kind of gets into the conversation of what means more, like a really good win on the road in College Station or a really bad loss to NIU at home. That's probably what the playoff committee is going to have to decipher between those two teams. Dill, the second team I want to go to is Texas A&M. Now, I'll say this, I was very close to putting Texas A&M over Notre Dame in these predictions, and I think there's a chance it gets there because you look at this Texas A&M team with Marcel Reed, even without Martin, like just this Texas A&M team as a whole, it feels different, drastically different from the Texas A&M team we saw week 1 lose to Notre Dame. I think secondly, and this is kind of my question with Texas A&M, and I'd love to hear from the Texas A&M fans in the comment section. Do you think Marcel Reed will still be as effective over the next couple of weeks when teams are game planning for Marcel Reed at quarterback? Because I think there was a certain element of, hey, we weren't really expecting to see Marcel Reed in this football game. When he got put into the football game, LSU just didn't have an answer. How much of do you think Marcel Reed maintains his effectiveness leading this Texas A&M offense when teams know they're going to get Marcel Reed and they're going to see a lot of read options?
I think he does for the sake of what A&M's trying to be. Like, do I think
Yeah.
they'll be able to cut through teams the way they cut through LSU? Maybe not, because again, like that little wrinkle and that unexpected kind of introduction to him into that game and how different stylistically they play it it certainly had its effect. But at the end of the day, he's going to play a style that's much more conducive to what A&M wants to be. I think they'll take less negative plays. I think they'll have less sacks. I think they'll have less turnovers. And all that is kind of like that's what A&M should be. Like they're not going to be an explosive offense. I don't think they have the wide receivers, frankly, to
Yeah.
really lean into Wigman's skill set. So I think just like as a team, they're a better fit for what Marcel Reed's going to bring them right now. As much as it won't be like as effective, maybe it's still going to be a better style.
100%. My biggest takeaway from that Texas A&M game, and I said this late Saturday night, was it seems like Texas A&M found their identity as a football team. Like, how do you want to win football games? Run the football, play good defense. That's what Marcel Reed brings to this Texas A&M offense. And as they continue, and there's also that argument that, hey, Marcel Reed might just get better as he gets more reps leading this Texas A&M offense. It's important to remember he's just a redshirt freshman. This is when you talk about the college football playoffs, I think you also got to talk about where teams trending. This Texas A&M team's
Well,
trending
I
in the
got a
right
quick
direction.
one for you on A&M. If they lose to the Horns in a tight one, are they in with 2 losses?
That because I think they roll until they see Texas. Now they get that game at home. Again, I think, yeah, they have a chance, but I think it has so much to do with some of the other teams around them as well. And that's kind of the conversation. That will be one of those conversations where 2-loss SEC team
Well, you're going to
versus,
look at possibly 2 lost teams in Texas A&M and Texas, who I think both are going to have an exceptionally good argument against teams from other conferences that are 1 lost team. That's kind of where I think it comes to.
yeah. And the thing is with the 2-loss SEC team versus a 1-loss Indiana team, I do think there's that element of like, look at the cross conference play over. Like you saw Texas go on the road, played Michigan, boat raced them. Now Michigan's not as good as we thought they were in the landscape of the Big Ten, but there's kind of some other, like when Tennessee goes out of conference and plays NC State, boat races them. When Georgia goes out of conference and plays Clemson, beat them pretty bad. Now I think that was a different Clemson team that we're seeing right now, but I do think that's going to kind of come into the conversation is when we're evaluating these conferences, should a 2-loss SEC team get in over a 1-loss Big Ten team? I think some of those cross-conference play game or playover games, I think are going to matter. And right now, SEC has, for what I'm thinking of, the important games that I'm thinking of. Now, the LSU USC game certainly hurts the SEC, but for the majority, I think the SEC probably has shown that they're still the best conference in the country, at least from a depth standpoint. Let's get into the Big Ten teams. I got 3 of them in: Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State. I knocked Ohio State down from the 5 to the 6, and it's largely just the question marks you're starting to see with Ohio State. The offensive line is becoming kind of a disaster, right? It was the question mark that we had for Ohio State. I wouldn't say disaster. A lot of more teams have worse offensive lines. But when you talk about going on the road and playing Penn State this weekend, that's a massive question mark, right? Nebraska was kind of feeding Ohio State, but it's not just that, Dill. Like you also look at the Ohio State defense and say these defensive backs, I mean, Denzel Burke really struggled against Oregon. Davison Ignosin really struggled against Nebraska with just being way too handsy. There are certain, we thought 2 weeks ago that Ohio State was checking a lot of boxes and looked like one of the most complete teams in the country. I still think that's the case. But now there are kind of some lingering question marks we have about this Ohio State team. How do you feel about Penn State coming in at 5, Ohio State at 6? So we're going to get our answer in 6 days here anyways.
I was gonna say, I think like that'll play itself out pretty quick.
Yeah.
My question is, a 2-loss Ohio State, are they pretty much cut?
Yes. No. Well, if they lose to Penn State on the road,
if they lose Penn State, Oregon, like that's kind of where I'm at.
And they don't play in the Big Ten championship,
I think they're in.
Dude, maybe. You're right. I think they're in too because like you're talking about your 2 losses would be against the top 2 teams in the country, both on the road, right? If Penn State beats Ohio State, they jump Georgia, I would think, in terms of the rankings. Yes. Yeah. Especially if they
look at Ohio State, like when you stack them against a potential 2-loss Tennessee team or a potential 2-loss Clemson, even if that loss comes in the ACC title game, I think it's going to be really hard to leave Ohio State off because as much as like there are those questions that exist, I think there is another gear that Ohio State can get to. I'm a little surprised they're not throwing the ball a little bit more. Like in that Nebraska game, I thought if they just threw the ball more, what they throw like 16 times, there were plays to be had. Like that wide receiver core, as much as people like to talk about other teams, that's elite. Like Jeremiah Smith's one of the best players in all of college football. And I think he's a guy who should probably have his imprint on games more. So there's a gear I think Ohio State can get to that they
Well,
didn't get to in that Nebraska game. But like that offensive line, it's going to come down
the
to that.
thing
If
is, they have to show the
offensive,
gear. That can't just be a hypothetical. Like we got to, like they better show that gear over the next couple of games. But they'll, at the end of the day, especially with that Oregon loss, where that one just eyeball test it. Like you can pretty much tell Ohio State's one of the best teams in the country from that game. Yeah, I do. A two-loss Ohio State team with law, and especially because if they can beat Indiana at home like pretty comfortably,
it's a really good
I
win.
think I think they get in. Yeah, I think they get in. Uh, let's dig into the ACC, which is down, right? Florida State
Down
really
bad.
really bad. SMU's coming on, so like there are some teams that are solid within the ACC. Got an undefeated Pitt. Miami, Clemson. I'll give you a scenario here. I have Miami still winning the ACC just because I trust this Miami Hurricanes offense right now a little bit more than what I see with Clemson. Although Clemson is turning it up on offense. If Miami runs the table, which they will, you look at the remaining schedule, I'm pretty confident that they're going to win out. They play Clemson in the ACC championship game. Miami wins. What do you do with what would it be, a 11-2 Clemson team that lost in the ACC championship? Oh, what says you about Clemson's chance to make the playoffs?
That is the one that I look at, like, again, and then you pull in an Indiana or one of these two-loss
Yep.
SEC schools, like, that gets really, really tough for Clemson because, again, that Georgia loss is always gonna hurt, like, I think that when you're not competitive in a game, that's
Yeah.
tough, like, Notre Dame, like, I don't like, yeah, it's a bad loss against NIU, but it doesn't feel the same as like a real beating you take at the hands of a Georgia. And even though it is, I think that's almost more excusable in a sense. A&M, like competitive loss to Notre Dame, Tennessee, competitive loss to Arkansas. Like you just don't see these other teams with like real beatings being put on them where
Yeah.
you don't even look competitive. So that to
It
me,
probably
it's tough.
sorry, it probably depends on like how do you look at you're going to play undefeated Pitt. You're going to play a Virginia Tech team that's starting to turn it up. And then how do you look against Miami? Like if you lose that football game, but you lose it by 3 points and you look really competitive against one of the best teams in the country, you probably got a better argument at getting in.
And they
And kind
also,
of,
like now that I think about it, like they're killing teams right now. They're really
yes,
taking teams to woodshed, and that again, all that matters. It's going to be a really tough debate because again, I look like a two-loss ACC team. Like they won't really have a good win if they don't beat Miami. That'll probably be the one fundamental issue. Like teams like Notre Dame, Tennessee, they'll have really, really good wins. Clemson just won't have a good win if they don't beat that Miami team or like a hang
yeah,
your hat.
they'll agreed. And then it kind of comes into like, all right, how did you look against the top 20 ranked Pitt? And I don't even know if Pitt's really a top 20 team in the country. They just are right now because and Pitt is a very good team. Like that's
I
not a
don't think
shot.
the Pitt win. I don't think the Pitt win gets the credit that an Alabama win gets. That's just kind of my.
Yeah, no, I
That's,
would I would agree with that too. Speaking of Alabama, let's talk about the SEC where dude, it's gonna be a massacre in the SEC in the month of November. Like you look at Georgia, they go on the road at Ole Miss, they play Tennessee. Texas should roll until Texas A&M, but then you get a Texas A&M game where that almost feels like a college football playoff game. You look at Tennessee, they go on the road at Georgia. Give me the teams in the SEC that you think are getting in to the college football playoffs. I currently have what 1, 2, 3, 4 getting in. Do you see a fifth squeaking in?
I don't think I'll see a fifth because again, I look like it'll be really tough to leave out a one-loss Indiana team at that point versus certain two-loss SEC teams. And again, like they'll have their signature win for sure. But I look if Indiana stays on the pace, they're beating teams really badly. If they play a competitive game against Ohio State,
Yeah,
I think
that
no matter, like, I think they're kind of in. If Indiana goes out and lays an egg and like, oh, so Indiana came back down to earth, that'll be a problem. But if they beat up Michigan really badly, if they beat some of those other teams they play and then play a tight one with Ohio State, no matter which way it goes, I think it's going to be really hard to leave them out. I also think it'll be hard to leave Ohio State out. So I think I think you'll get 4 SEC teams. I think
yeah,
Georgia, one of the A&M, Texas, one of those is almost a guarantee right now. I think
yep.
Tennessee's got a really, really good shot. And then it'll kind of be about who that last team is. I think one team like an LSU can still get in if they win out or do something good. Ole Miss, I still think can probably make their case. So I think you'll get 4, probably minimum 4.
I
I think
don't
they'll
think
have
you can get 5. Yeah, I don't think you can get 5 just mathematically speaking. Like these teams, like I haven't run the numbers in my brain
I
yet.
think you can because they could for sure leave out a 2-loss Clemson team. Like they could for sure
Yeah.
leave out a Notre Dame. Like Indiana's
I
not
don't
a
think you leave
guarantee
out
at
Notre Dame.
11-1.
I don't think you leave out personally, you know, like you have one gross loss at home to
They'd
NIU.
have to lose again. That's fair. If they win out, they're fine.
Because they're I mean, well, I was gonna say they're gonna play Florida State. That doesn't really count. They play USC at the end of the season. I feel like if Notre Dame runs the table, it's gonna be hard to leave them out, especially if Texas A&M continues to kind of take care of business and look like one of the better teams in the SEC. It's just tough because you have Alabama and Ole Miss and LSU, like those 3 teams that have 2 losses, but they're kind of like lingering. And all three of those teams, especially Alabama and Ole Miss, like national championship caliber ceiling when they play their best football. And so they could nip a team. And then you're starting to talk about 2 and 3 loss SEC teams versus a 1 loss Indiana. At the end of the day, it just depends if Indiana is competitive against Ohio State and like shows they belong at the top end of college football. Boise State coming in as the group of 5, beating UNLV. And
That
if
locked
Notre
it
Dame
up.
beats Navy and Army, I do feel like that's pretty locked up. Anywhere else you want to go, Dale? Like we're doing these right now. Like they're going to change every single Saturday. We're going to have plenty of games this week, especially Ohio State, Penn State. They kind of shake up the bracket a little bit. I think we're good.
The hinge ones to me are the 2-loss SEC teams. Those are going to be the ones that are going to cause the fights and the problems and the accusations against ESPN or
Yeah,
whoever. Like
yeah.
those to me will fundamentally be the issue because you're going to look like you're going to leave off a Tennessee team that goes 11-2 if they lose to Georgia. Like it's going to be tough to leave them out. It's going to be really tough to leave out a 2-loss A&M or Texas. Like those are
Yeah.
kind of the teams that I know people are going to fight about, and I'll be fighting that battle alongside everyone else. I don't know which side I'll be on, but I'll be in the trenches doing it. Those are going to be the swing teams, if you
I
will.
think it straight up just comes down to like yes, resume, but like there's gonna be a lot of teams that have like playoff resumes. Where one of those like 4 teams, like it's pretty clear that there's like 4 or 5, maybe 6 on a competitive year that had playoff resumes. There's going to be like 18 teams that have playoff resumes. Then it kind of comes into eyeball test. Like, what do these teams look like in the month of November? What teams do we think are legitimately? Because I do think like the playoff committee, they want to get good games. So like they're not going to throw a team in there, even if they have a good resume, but you don't think they're necessarily, you think they're kind of a pretender. They're not going to get
Cincinnati
in.
ruined it for all of us. They had the resume, they go in, play a non-competitive game.
Yeah,
This
we'll see. It's gonna be a wild one. It's gonna be very fun. We'll probably like get into individual teams and like talk about what needs to happen. We'll sign out here again. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.